The hounds arrived before sundown and took their places beside the ashes. Not after, not during. Before, as if they had a schedule, as if the arrival had to happen at a specific time. And they were the kind of animals that honored schedules. The burn site was just the burn site. The footprint of what had been, the blackened rectangle of earth, the scatter of debris that the snow had been covering and uncovering through the winter. There was nothing visible there to wait for. The hounds waited anyway. Jacob Pierce had been in the valley for 22 years when he died. He had come to the East Ridge property in 1855 at the age of 28 and had been there since. He had built the cabin himself. He had cleared the fields incrementally, the way a man cleared fields who was also doing everything else. A few acres at a time, a few seasons at a time, building the property the way someone built something they intended to keep. He had married Martha in 1863, and she had come to the East Ridge property and learned its rhythms, which were Jacob's rhythms, which were steady and unpretentious and reliable. He was a man who was known more through the work he did than through what he said about it. He was present at the shared labor of the valley. He was reliable. He was the man you called when something needed doing, and who showed up without discussion. He had 3 hounds. He had trained them himself from pups, with a patience and consistency that people talked about at the mill. Dogs trained by Jacob Pierce worked cleanly, held their range, came when called in conditions when other dogs wouldn't. He had been doing this his entire adult life. The fire had come in January. Martha Pierce had been at the Aldred property for 4 days before the fire. The birth had been slow, the kind that kept women together for days rather than hours. And she had been needed, and she had stayed. She had sent word to Jacob that she would be another night, and he had sent word back that the animals were fine and not to worry. She had been at the Aldred property, helping with a birth that had been expected for 2 weeks. When the storm moved in from the north and the temperature dropped to the kind of cold that made the air feel wrong, Jacob had been home. He had been home and the cabin had burned, and by the time anyone knew, there was nothing to save. She had buried him in the family plot on the east slope. She had received the valley's care, and she had moved into the Aldred spare room for the winter, and she had made the decisions that surviving a thing required. She had been 41 years old, and she had not allowed herself to stop moving, because stopping felt like a choice she could not yet afford. She was 41 years old, and she had the quality of someone who had decided, early, that she was going to live through whatever happened to her. She did not perform grief. She received the valley's care, and the valley did not press her for more than she gave. The 3 hounds had been at the property when the fire happened. They had not been inside. People found them in the morning after, sitting at the edge of the burn site in the cold. They were assumed to be confused. Animals were confused by catastrophic change. This was understood. People had taken them in. One to the Harlan farm, one to Gaught's property, one to a family down the drainage. The valley had been discussing the dogs at the mill, at the church, at the ordinary points of exchange that kept a small settlement informed about itself. The consensus, such as it was, held at confused animals. The standard account, the reasonable account, the account that required the least revision of what people understood about how dogs worked. The families who had taken them in had not thought to pen them. They were visitors, guests, animals displaced by a tragedy. And the assumption was that they would settle, as displaced animals settled, into their new temporary arrangement. The following evening, all 3 were back at the burn site. Nobody organized the return. Nobody led them there. The 3 dogs had spent the day at 3 separate properties and had, at some point in the late afternoon, left those properties and made their way to the ashes of the Pierce cabin and taken up their positions. The positions were consistent from the first night. The oldest hound, a red and tan dog that had been Jacob's lead dog for 7 years, sat on the south side of what had been the porch, facing the center of the burn. The younger 2 sat on either side, slightly behind, the arrangement of dogs that had spent years working in formation. They sat. They did not bark. They did not dig into the ashes. They did not howl, which was what people expected from hounds in distress. They simply sat in their positions and faced the center of the burn and waited for something that, by every visible account, was not coming. When full dark fell, they left. The following evening, they were back. The positions were what people talked about first. Anyone who came to see expected the behavior to look like distress, expected the pacing, the whining, the searching behavior of animals that had lost something. What they found was the opposite. The hounds were still. The positions were deliberate. There was no searching in it. By the end of the first week, the valley had begun to watch. People came in the afternoons, casually, in the way of people finding reasons to walk past that property. The hounds arrived before sundown without fail. The lead dog first, then the other 2 within minutes of each other, as if they had agreed on timing and were holding to it. They took their positions. They sat. They waited. People tried things. The farmer who had taken in one of the younger hounds penned him on the 3rd evening, wanting to see what would happen. The dog was there at the burn site by the following morning. He had gone through the pen, not in a way that suggested panic, not with the destructive energy of an animal that had been alarmed, but in the methodical way of an animal with a destination and enough intelligence to remove what stood between him and it. The farmer came back on the 4th evening and penned the dog more securely. A better pen, 2 latches, a heavier chain. The dog was at the burn site in the morning. The farmer told this to Galt. Galt said, "What do you think that means?" The farmer said, "I think it means the dog is going where it's going, regardless of what we do." Galt said, "Yes." Another man tied the lead dog to a fence post a 1/4 mile from the site. The rope was at the fence post in the morning. The dog was at the burn site. A 3rd family moved one of the younger dogs to a property 2 miles down the drainage, thinking the distance would break whatever pattern was driving the behavior. That evening, there were only 2 hounds at the burn site. The following evening, all 3 were back. The missing dog had covered 2 miles of hill country at some point in the day and arrived at its position before sundown. The practical man who had proposed the smell theory came back with a shovel one morning and dug at the burned site while nobody was watching. He found what burned ground contained: ash, char, the turned soil of the fire's aftermath. Nothing that explained the dogs. He told no one about the shovel experiment. People came to different conclusions about what this meant. Some said, the property pulls them. Some said, they can smell something under the ashes. Some said, hounds were bred to work alone and travel distances, and this was simply the hound nature expressing itself. These explanations were offered and examined and filed. Nobody tried to stop them after that. Martha came to the burn site in February. She had not gone immediately. She had stayed at the Aldred property through January, which was the correct order of things, the practical necessities of winter, the grief that had to be held while the hands were doing other things. In February, she came to look at what was left. She arrived at midday. She stood at the edge of the burn, and she looked at the footprint that Jacob's cabin had left on the ground. The shape of the foundation, the scatter of debris, the particular silence of a place that had been full of life and was now only ground. She looked at the dogs' positions. The cleared ground showed them. The south side, the flanking arrangement, the slight forward lean of animals attending to something. She knew this arrangement. She had seen it hundreds of times from the kitchen window and from the porch on summer evenings. She already knew where they would be. She had been told. Several people had described it to her in the careful way they brought her information they were not sure she needed. The kind of telling that was more about watching for her reaction than about the information itself. She had listened to each account with the same steady attention. She had listened, and she had said nothing. She stood at the burn site and she looked at the positions, and she understood immediately what the dogs were doing. She did not say anything about it. She went back to the Aldred property. She let the valley keep watching. She thought, they will understand it or they won't, and either way is fine. What they'll do is keep watching, and the dogs will keep arriving, and at some point the behavior will change, or it won't. She didn't need the valley to understand it the same way she did. She had 14 years of Jacob sitting on those steps. She had the context. She could afford to wait. If stories like this find you on the road home, subscribe and ride along. The valley watched through February. It developed the habit of that winter, the way valleys developed habits around unusual things, by incorporating them into the ordinary. People checked on the way to the mill, coming back from neighbors in the early evening before supper. The Hounds became a fact of the valley's days, noted and reliable there when people looked. They became the subject of the kind of sustained community attention that small settlements brought to things that resisted explanation. Not fear. The Hounds were not threatening anything. Not superstition exactly, though the language around them sometimes borrowed from that direction. Something more like interest. The valley had a puzzle on its hands, and it was watching the puzzle. People brought their children to see. Not in a dramatic way, not a spectacle, but in the way that parents brought children to see unusual things worth seeing. The Hound sitting at the burned site in the January dusk was something worth seeing, the children were told, without a full explanation of why. The children had strong opinions. Children in the Ozark hill country were taught from early about hounds, their working nature, their training, the specific partnership between a hunting dog and the man who trained it. They knew that hounds were not pets in the ordinary sense, but working animals, with working routines and working intelligence. What the Pierce Hounds were doing did not fit any working routine the children had been taught about. One boy said, "They're waiting for him to come back." His father said, "He's not coming back." The boy said, "They don't know that." His father said nothing. The boy looked at the dogs and said, "Do you think it hurts them?" His father said, "I don't know." The boy said, "I think maybe it does." His father said, "Maybe." The boy said, "They don't know that." His father said nothing. A woman who had been in the valley since her childhood and had seen things she categorized as unusual said, "Animals know things about the dead that we don't." She said it simply, without dramatizing it. A man who prided himself on practical thinking said, "They're smelling something. The fire changed the chemistry of the ground. There's something under the ashes they can detect." The minister said, "God's creatures mourn in their own way." The children said, "They're waiting for him." All of these were held by different people with different degrees of certainty, and none of them changed what the Hounds did each evening. Old Galt, who had been the one to observe the lead dog's departure from his property on the first evening, and who had been watching the gathering since, said to his wife, "The dogs aren't confused. Confused animals don't hold a schedule for 3 weeks." She said, "What are they doing?" He said, "I don't know yet." One evening in February, the blizzard came. It had been building in the sky all day. The low, dense cloud cover of a serious storm, the temperature dropping through the afternoon, the quality of the air that carried the specific weight of heavy weather. By 4 o'clock, the snow was coming down in the particular way that meant the roads would be impossible by morning. Nobody expected the hounds. The storm was bad enough that people were not going out. The farms were closed in, the families gathered, the sensible thing being to stay inside and let the storm do what storms did. At sundown, the hounds were at the burn site. He had been at the stove when the movement caught his eye through the window. He had looked out, expecting nothing, the empty field, the snow, and had seen the shapes at the burn site. A neighbor saw them from his window. He watched them through the glass. 3 shapes in the blowing snow, in their positions, sitting with the same stillness they brought every evening, regardless of weather. The snow accumulated on their backs as they sat. She had watched from the Harlan property, and she had waited for them to move, to shake it off, to do what dogs did when they were cold and uncomfortable. They sat. They stayed until dark. They came back the following evening. Martha moved back to the property in March, when the ground was passable. She moved into a temporary structure the valley had put up for her. A 1-room building, small, serviceable, built by a work party on a Saturday in late February. It was not the cabin Jacob had built. It was what was available. The temporary structure was small, and the window faced west, which was useful in the evenings. The light came through directly in the last hour before sunset, making the burn site visible and warm-lit. The kind of light that made things look more complete than they were. She had not expected to feel what she felt the first evening she watched them from the window of the temporary structure. She had expected something difficult. The dogs at the burn site, keeping their vigil, the grief of that visible and present. She had prepared herself for it. What she felt instead was something more like recognition, like seeing a habit she had known for 14 years continuing in her absence. The shape of it was Jacob's shape, even without Jacob in it. She was there in the evenings when the hounds arrived. She had been given a chair from the Aldred house that sat well at the window. She had positioned it in the first week back, and she had not moved it. She watched them from the window of the temporary structure. She made no attempt to call them over or feed them or establish the kind of relationship with them that a person established with dogs that visited regularly. She watched them take their positions, and she sat in the window, and she watched them wait. People had begun to notice Martha more carefully than they might have otherwise, not in the way of people watching someone who was struggling, but in the way of people who had noticed that she understood something they did not, and were watching for the understanding to become visible. They had expected grief to make her less. She was not less. People noticed that she never tried to stop them. They had expected her to be the one to object, the person with the clearest claim on the dogs, the person whose property they were visiting, the person whose grief the visits most directly implicated. She never objected. She never asked anyone to intervene. When people asked her about the hounds, she listened to their observations and said little in response. One woman said to her, "Doesn't it hurt, watching them wait for him?" Martha said, "No." She said, "They're not waiting for him." The woman looked at her. Martha said nothing else. She told Galt in April. He had come to the property to help with the fence line on the east field, the fence that needed spring repair after a winter of neglect. They had been working through the afternoon, and in the late afternoon she had said, without preamble, "I know what they're doing." He had straightened and looked at her. She said, "You've been watching the dogs all winter." He said, "Yes." She said, "Have you ever seen hounds behave like this?" He thought, then said, "No." She said, "I know what they're doing." He straightened and looked at her. She said, "Jacob ended every hunting day here. He would come back from the timber and he would sit beside the cabin, on the porch steps in good weather wherever he could in bad, and the dogs would gather around him. He did this every day, from the first day he had the dogs to the last fall before the fire. They don't understand why the cabin is gone. They understand that this is where the day ends. They're doing what they've always done at the end of the day." Galt looked at the burn site. He said, "How long had he been doing that?" She said, "As long as I knew him. He told me once that a dog needed a ritual as much as a man did, that the ritual told the dog where it stood in the day. He was consistent about it. Same time, same place, every day. The day hasn't ended for them." He stood with that for a while. He had been in this country 40 years, and he had watched animals his entire adult life. And he had the farmer's knowledge of what animals knew and how they knew it. What Martha had described was consistent with everything he understood about how dogs learned and remembered. The ritual had been the structure of the day. The day was the burn site. The dogs were keeping the day. He said, "Do you think it will?" She said, "I don't know. I think it has to, but I don't know when." Spring came. The valley had expected the hounds to stop with the end of winter, had told itself that the behavior was somehow connected to the cold, to the dormancy of everything, to the contracted quality of a landscape in hard weather. When spring came and the hounds were still arriving at sundown every evening, the theory was revised. The month of March passed, and the hounds arrived every evening. By April, the valley had largely stopped expecting the behavior to end and had started simply accepting it. The hounds arrived. They sat. They left. This was what the hounds did. The valley had found its accommodation with it. The evenings were the hardest part. This was true of most grief, she understood. The time of day when the person who was gone would have been present. The particular vacancy of the hours when presence had been reliable. For her, the evenings had been Jacob on the porch steps and the dogs around him. She had been in the kitchen, and the porch had been occupied, and the day had been structured. Now the kitchen had no porch, and the porch had no steps, and the dogs were at the burn site, keeping the structure of the day, that no longer had a day to structure. Martha watched them each evening from the window of the temporary structure, and she thought about Jacob, about the quality of his presence in the years she had known him, about the specific rituals she had described to Galt, about the evening gathering that had been so consistent, so reliable, that his dogs had incorporated it into their understanding of how the day was structured. She thought about the years of it, the 14 years of sundown gatherings, the consistency of Jacob in his routines, the way he had structured the day with the same care he brought to everything. She had been the one who watched from the window. He had been the one who sat. She had thought, on some of those evenings, that the ritual was as much for him as for the dogs, that the gathering was how he told himself the day was done and that he could rest. She thought, He trained good dogs. She thought that's what good training does. It outlasts the trainer. One evening in early May near sundown, the hounds arrived. They took their positions, the lead dog on the south side, the younger two flanking. They sat and they faced the center of the burn, and the sun moved toward the ridge. And then, while the light was still in the sky, before full dark, which had always been when they left, the lead dog stood. He stood, and he looked at the burn site for a long time. Martha watched from the window. He had never done this before, had never stood while there was still light, had never done anything that deviated from the routine. He turned and walked north, toward the timber. She sat at the window, and she watched him go, and she watched the other two dogs rise from their positions and follow. They walked with the purposeful pace of dogs that knew where they were going. They did not look back. She sat at the window for a long time after they were gone into the evening. Martha stayed at the window until the light was gone. They did not come back. The following evening, she was at the window at the usual time. She stayed until full dark. The burn site was empty. She thought about what she had said to Galt. I don't know when. She thought, now is when. She thought about the 7 years of Jacob's ritual, the daily sundown gathering, the particular constancy of it. She thought about what it meant for a habit to run its course, not broken, not abandoned, but finished. She thought about her husband. She thought about him in the specific way of someone who had spent the winter thinking around a thing and was now permitted to think directly at it. At Jacob, specifically. The man. The weight of his presence in the 14 years of it. She thought about the texture of his company on those evenings, the way the porch smelled in fall, the sound of him coming in from the cold. She thought about the day that had been ending for 4 months at the south edge of the burn site. In the same place he had always ended it. The 3 dogs keeping the form of the thing after the meaning had gone. She thought. The day ended. She thought about Jacob sitting on the porch steps in the evenings of their 14 years, the dogs around him, the valley going dark. She had watched it from the kitchen more times than she could count. She had made supper while he sat. She had called him in when it was ready, and he had come when it was dark enough, never sooner, always before full dark. The dogs had gone to the barn. She had not noticed, in 14 years, how reliable the pattern was. You didn't notice reliable things. That was what made them reliable. She thought, and now it's dark enough. She turned the lamp up. Martha did not go to the burn site the following evening. She watched from the window. The burn site was empty. The valley noticed the absence the following morning, the way people notice the absence of things that had been present long enough to be expected. Several people mentioned it to each other, then to their families. By the end of the week, it was known throughout the valley. The hounds had stopped coming. People had various things to say about this. Most of them circled back to what Martha had told Galt, the ritual, the structure of the day having ended. The account made sense of it in a way that felt true without being complete. Nobody knew what had changed on that May evening. Nobody had seen the lead dog stand and turn. Only Martha had seen that. She told it to Galt the following Sunday, quietly, on the way out of church. He said, "Did you know it was the last time?" She said, "I thought it might be." Something in the way he stood. He said, "Where do you think they went?" She thought. Then said, "Hunting. Where else?" He looked at her. She said, "Jacob used to say that a dog needed its work the way a man needed his work. That without the work, a dog didn't know what it was. They had a different life before Jacob died. They were hunting dogs, Whatever held them here, whatever part of the day they were waiting for, I think it let go. I'm glad, he said. So am I. I'll tell people what you told me, what you said about the ritual. She said, tell it how you like. The account is what it is. He said, do you know what you'll do now? She said, farm, same as before. He said, with them? She said, I think they'll come back to work when they're ready. A good hunting dog doesn't forget what it is. Jacob would have said that. He said he would. They walked on. Summer came to the valley, and the dogs went back to their respective properties and worked as hunting dogs worked through the summer, ranging, resting, doing the ordinary animal business of a working season. People asked Martha, occasionally, if they had come back. She said no. They said they were sorry, and she said, I'm not. The valley talked about it well into summer, which was unusual. Most unusual things from one season faded by the next. The Pierce Hounds were still being discussed in July, when someone brought it up at the mill in the context of dogs and training, and what dogs remembered. And 3 people who had been there through the winter had opinions and offered them. What the valley kept was the shape of it. The valley kept the account of the Pierce Hounds the way it kept the accounts that were not easily explained. Carefully, with the specific care of people who understood that some things were worth preserving accurately. What they kept was the shape of it. The winter, the evening arrivals, the blizzard, the months of it. The lead dog's position on the south side, the flanking of the younger 2. The way they came before sundown, the way they stayed until dark, the way nothing changed it, and Martha at the window, watching without trying to stop them. When people told the account, they always mentioned her. Not because she had an explanation. She had offered one to Galt, and Galt had told others, and it was true as far as it went. But explanations were not what people remembered about the Pierce Hounds. What they remembered was Martha, not afraid, not performing grief. Watching the dogs keep their appointment and understanding something about it that she did not need to make into words. The valley never agreed on why the hounds waited beside the burned cabin through that winter. But everyone who saw them remembered the same thing. The way they arrived before sundown every evening, as if keeping an appointment no one else could see.